Right. Welcome to Writing Long-Term and Short-Term Goals for Language and Literacy. We will be talking about setting goals for target forms, constructions, phonemes, and other measures of progress. So what is a goal? Goals establish where you intend to go and tell you when you get there. They're relatively long-term, a semester, or on IEPs, typically a year, and they specify what will be different when the goal is achieved. So, for example, in Goal 1, the child will process language during reading, resulting in fluent and accurate reading at a third grade readability level. We just assessed our children and we found out that a lot of them could not read at grade level, that they read with poor intonation, poor phrasing, and could not answer the comprehension questions. So we're going to improve. So if they were reading at a second grade level, we're going to improve that to a third grade level, but actually have fluent reading and accurate reading. Goal 2, the child will produce a written story characterized by narrative discourse elements, grade appropriate sentences, and phonetic, transitional, and conventional spelling attempts. So you can see that the goals are specifying what will be different when the goal is achieved. One system is the SMART system used to establish these kinds of goals. S means be specific. The goal should be very specific, something you can chart daily to see if you're making progress. Measurable. To chart something, it must be measurable. This means it must be defined in measurable terms. Achievable. The goals need to be within your child's ZPD. So Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development. It should be difficult enough to present a challenge, but not above your child's current level of learning, according to Vygotsky's theory. You estimate this from your pre-testing data. The goals should be realistic. The expected outcome needs to be attainable for the child in the time frame given his or her current language level. So we've got a semester, so the goal has to be realistic to complete in a semester. On IEPs, the goal might be 1 year. Time, specific relevant time information, such as when the post-test will occur in 1 semester, or things like the number of times correct, 8 out of 10, and so forth. Here's an example goal for reading. Here's the pretest data. Use the pretest data to establish realistic goals. Data shows that a 4th grade child read the Gort passages with poor fluency rate and comprehension, attaining a grade equivalency of 2.2. So he's about 2 grade levels below his actual level. Time is going to be 1 semester, or you could have 8 out of 10 times for 3 consecutive days. Needs to be realistic. So we're going to estimate that he should improve to a 3.0 grade point equivalency. Achievable, you'll have 45 minutes each week to work towards the goal. Measurable, you will measure miscues, rate, and comprehension. So specifically, he'll read with 90% fluency, complete a 100-word passage under 35 seconds, and answer factual, inferential, and figurative questions. There are long-term goals and short-term goals. So long-term goals involve results that will often take months or years to achieve. These might include long-term goals such as raising scores on a standardized achievement test, rating at a level commensurate with age or grade level, or successfully completing a multi-year therapy program. So this is what you hope for the child's progress to look like over the long term. This is an example of using SMART information to write a long-term goal. By the end of the year, which is your time, the child will read his or her grade level, realistic and achievable, with specific rate, accuracy, and responses, with average rate, accuracy, and response to comprehension questions. So these are going to be specific and implied measurable outcomes. Here's the goal without the SMART language. By the end of the year, a child will read at his or her grade level with an average rate, accuracy, and response to comprehension questions. To accomplish this, the child will need to improve in his or her ability to process syntax, cohesion, vocabulary, higher-level semantics, phonology, orthography, narrative and/or expository text structure, morphology, and pragmatics. So these become your measurable goals. So again, we're not reading teachers, we are language teachers. And what's in that language that's preventing the child from reading with good rate, fluency, and accuracy? And again, we're looking at the child's ability to process the syntax, the cohesion, the vocabulary, the higher level semantics, the phonology, orthography, the discourse structures, morphology, and pragmatics. All of these language skills will be important to helping that child to improve their reading level, because reading is a language skill. So short-term goals. The short-term goal is specific objective that the client must master before he or she is able to achieve the long-term goal. Short-term goals focus on specific targets, units, tasks, or steps, and are usually achieved in a short time period. The short-term goal the short-term goals the client is working on will usually change quickly as he or she masters those and new short-term goals are established. All goals have to be written behaviorally. Behaviorally written goals specify elements of the goal that need to be achieved. They are specific, measurable descriptions of these elements. They describe how the goal will be measured, what test material or activity will be used to obtain the measure, what will be counted or measured, what is the criterion for success, and when will the goal be measured. Some other important things about goals. Note that all goals begin with the client's name and a future tense verb. Jane will do something. Performance. Performance refers to what you expect the client to do or perform to show mastery of the goal. Jane will produce voiceless consonants. So if this is an articulation goal, then you're going to say this is something that she'll be able to do. The verbs are very important in goals. They should be concrete and they should be things that can be evaluated or seen. So examples of appropriate verbs include Jane will be able to name something. Jane will be able to read orally at a second grade level. Jane will repeat orally. Jane will state the names of 3 states. Will be able to write, match, count, demand, draw, say, reach, remove. These are all observable verbs, things that you can actually observe and measure. The verb should not be one that could be interpreted differently by different people. So inappropriate verbs would be things like no. These are usually theory of mind verbs, things that you would have to be able to look into the other person's mind. How do you know that he knows the alphabet, but he can recite the alphabet? How do you know that he has letter-sound correspondence? Well, he can, given a letter, he can give you the corresponding sound. Understand, appreciate, enjoy, learn, believe. Again, these are things that cannot be seen, and these are not appropriate verbs. Another part of the goal is the condition. This part of the goal refers to the condition under which the performance is to be done. Jane will produce voiceless consonants when preceding vowels. So it's not all contexts, but only those preceding vowels. In single syllables, in bisyllabic words, during conversation, while reading, when telling a story, without prompts, within a 2-second period, while talking on the telephone, without yanking the clinician's arm, during each therapy session. You're being very specific about under what conditions you expect this child's behavior to be measured. And then the criterion. This part of the goal refers to how well the client is expected to perform the goal. For example, 90% of the time, 8 out of 10 attempts for 3 consecutive trials in 2 consecutive sessions. Jane will produce voiceless consonants when preceding vowels in 90% of the appropriate contexts. Criterion of 90% is usually used in speech and language therapy. All right, so now we're going to get very specific about our reading language goals. We're going to go through the different areas of language and talk about some of our long and short-term goals. So this one is for syntax. The long-term, student will improve ability to process compound and complex sentences at a 3rd grade readability level. So if we identify that syntax is one of the reasons that this child is failing to read fluently and accurately and with good comprehension, then this is going to be consistent with our improving the reading level to a 3rd grade level. So the short-term goal is going to be, given a 3rd grade narrative reading passage, child will read compound and complex sentences with correct intonation, phrasing, and expression to correspond with the meaning with 90% accuracy. So I can go in and I can count what the intonation was like at the beginning. 40% correct intonation, 35% phrasing, 40% correct expression. At the end, I'm hoping that those percentages will change and go up to the 90% criterion. How will I accomplish this? During reading of second to third grade reading passages, the clinician will listen for drops in volume, incorrect phrasing, reading past punctuation, incorrect intonation, or incorrect responses to comprehension questions. The clinician will use corrective feedback, including parsing the sentence into constituent phrases and explaining the connections between them, pointing out phrases that have been moved to the beginning or other non-canonical places in the sentence, drawing out the relationships between phrases on a whiteboard using stick figure pictures, or physically having children act out the actions, dialogue, and other difficult elements. We looked at this 4-leaf luck PowerPoint in class, so if you need to work on syntax yourself, go ahead and practice on that PowerPoint, and also it'll teach you some of the ways that we work with kids to help them process that complex syntax. The complex sentence says, one spring day, Danny was playing with his friends who lived down the street, Zach and Mark. In the red, we can see the basic kernel sentence. Danny was playing with his friends. So there's our noun, verb, phrase, prepositional phrase. And then there's one spring day, which is an adverbial clause, which may be at the end of the sentence or it may be after the verb. Danny was playing one spring day with his friends. But in the target sentence, the author had moved that adverbial clause to the beginning of the sentence, which is allowed. And when that occurs, then you can see that the phrase is followed by a comma. One spring day, comma, Danny was playing with his friends. The second sentence, his friends lived down the street, again is a basic kernel sentence. His friends, the noun phrase, lived is the verb, down the street is another prepositional phrase. You'll notice that in the two sentences, the phrase his friends is common to both sentences. So I can substitute one of them with a pronoun. If I wanted to leave the two sentences, I could put they lived down the street. One day Danny was playing with his friends. They lived down the street. But if I want to combine them into a single complex sentence, then I'm going to have to use the relative pronoun who. Danny was playing with his friends, or one spring day Danny was playing with his friends who lived down the street. So the PowerPoint shows you how to combine those elements so that the child can actually see it happen. And then it also shows you how to add the appositive structure, Zach and Mark. Okay, so those kinds of things can be done with the PowerPoint. You can work with the children using that kind of a tool. The other one is basically taking the sentences from the readings that they're working on, and you use these visualizations of these little squares, and you just draw on a whiteboard the relationships between the ideas in the sentence. So the sentence in the book was, when she raced up 4 flights of stairs to the bedroom, she got there before her sister. Okay, so when we lay it out, we put that conjunction, when. She ran up 4 flights of stairs. You can see the 4 flights of stairs in different colors. To her bedroom, comma, she got there before her sisters. And then there's a period. Well, the actual kernel sentence is, she got there before her sisters when she raced up 4 flights of stairs to her bedroom. So again, we can look at, just as we did with 4-leaf luck, we can look at the beginning sentence, she got there before her sisters, and then we can show that we can join those sentences with when, and then I can move that whole sentence and the conjunction to the beginning of the sentence. But if I do that, I need to mark it with a comma. So as you're explaining this and showing it to kids and showing them how to unpack that language and how to put it back together into complex sentences, they begin to see these patterns of syntax. And after you do it numerous times during your interactions with the kids, they begin to process these long, complex, embedded sentences with transformational movement of parts of the sentences to the beginning of the sentence or elsewhere in sentences. and then they learn how to interpret and read those sentences on their own. Here's another goal, cohesion. The long-term goal, student will improve ability to process cohesive ties at a third grade readability level. So the short-term goal, given a third grade narrative reading passage, child will correctly identify the pronoun referent within and across sentences and paragraphs, provide information implied from sentences with ellipsis, and explain the relationship between conjunction clauses with 90% accuracy. All of these cohesive ties are very difficult to process. During the preschool years, kids have difficulty with pronouns, just getting the gender and subject-object relationships down. They're also then very likely to have difficulty with cohesive ties that cross the boundaries of sentences and paragraphs. So you can see pronoun reference 30%, ellipsis 35%, conjunctions 40% at pretest, and you're hoping for 90% accuracy at post-test. So how will we accomplish this? During reading of second to third grade reading passages, the clinician will point back and forth between the pronouns and their reference while explaining. They, the people in the boat, according to the statement in a previous paragraph, didn't know what to do. The clinician will ask questions to check whether the child processed the ellipsis. Didn't know what to do. What does the word do mean? Explain what their choices are. Or conjunctions, they stayed in the boat even though water was coming in. What does the author mean by even though? All right, so here's just an example from a fifth grade passage. One day her teacher said, so we start out with her as an unidentified pronoun. Her teacher said, Carmen, are you all right? So her now refers to Carmen. And then you refers back to Carmen. I've noticed, so now the I is going to refer to the teacher. I've noticed you, back to Carmen, squinting a lot. Are you having trouble seeing the board? Carmen shook her head. So Carmen and her are the same referent. This time the I that used to be the teacher is now Carmen. I'm fine, Mrs. Cruz, she said, but she knew that she was not fooling her. And you have to keep those pronouns straight. I really am, she thought to herself. Am is an example of an ellipsis. I really am having trouble seeing the board. And so the kids won't have a referent, often won't have a reference for am. That, you can see the actual sentence was, but she knew she was not fooling her. And without the word that in the surface of the sentence, kids might not be able to process that that's actually an embedded sentence there. At home, she had to sit closer and closer to the television in order to see it. So again, there's that conjunction that's missing from the sentence. Her mother noticed her squinting as she watched her favorite shows, and she began to get suspicious. So most of those pronouns, her is Carmen, her is Carmen, she is Carmen, her is Carmen, and she is mother. But mother's name is not mentioned again. So cohesion is very, very difficult to follow. The green has to do with things that are related to each other, that keep the topic flowing. Are you all right? You're squinting, which is not all right. Squinting has to do with seeing. But she knew that she was not fooling her, so saying that she's all right and fooling her that she's really not all right. Closer and closer is an example of developing the theme further. See, squinting, watched, suspicious, eye doctor, appointment, all of those things keep the words, and that's called lexical cohesion, keeps the topic developing. Okay, so cohesive ties are a big reason why kids can lose fluency, comprehension, not be able to get the meaning from the passage. Semantics is another area. Student will improve ability to provide a contextually appropriate interpretation of implied, evaluative, and figurative language at third grade reading level. So it's, part of reading comprehension is just getting the factual information, but especially as the grade levels increase, the comprehension really comes from higher level meanings that are not explicitly stated in the words. So, the short-term goal, given a third grade reading passage, narrative reading passage, child will explain the meaning of an implied, evaluative, or figurative statement in the context of the story with 90% accuracy. And again, we give the pretest current levels. Also note that response to these higher level questions is one of the primary measures of reading comprehension. So how will you achieve the goals for semantics? During reading of second to third grade reading passages, the adult will anticipate unfamiliar concepts, point to the word or phrase, and provide meaning. So if you just think they're going to have problems with it, just go ahead and give them the meaning. Modeling how you have to read at this higher level. Show pictures of the concept or meaning, or ask guiding questions that will lead the child to determine the meaning of the passage along a continuum of semantic levels. Guiding questions mean that you don't just ask them the question and give them the answer. You give them questions, a series of questions that guide them to come up with the meaning. Well, why did the child say that? Well, look at what it says up here. It says that he was worried, so why would the child say this? What is he worried about? Look at the sentence before that. Tell me what he's worried about. So now what does this mean? Okay, and also encourage the child to ask questions when something isn't understood. One of the things about poor readers is that they just think that it's getting the words right and fast, and they don't ask questions. Okay, the semantic continuum refers to the diagram on the left. At the bottom you see a reaction, which is just looking at something when you hear something or responding, in some way to some sensory information. Indication is pointing, and that could be a legitimate answer if you say, well, can you find this in the picture? The first verbal one is labeling. Some of the examples of what labeling looks like is these are koala bears. The baby is called a joey. Koala bears live in a country called Australia. So you're basically labeling things. Description. What's the mother koala doing? Help children use verbs such as sitting, resting, looking, carrying. What is the baby doing? Holding on, climbing, hugging, snuggling. So give them vocabulary and language to describe the actions behaviorally. Attributions. So you're looking now at some characteristics beyond just labeling and describing. So you're looking at some of the characteristics. So when you look at the koala bears, well, what do they look like? Encourage adjectives such as soft, furry, brown and white, big-nosed, strong legs, round eyes, chubby long hair on ears, dark noses. So it's language that goes more into adjectives and adverbs that start giving attributes. Interpretation. How do the koalas feel? Why? Are they happy, safe, comfortable, friendly, curious? So this is now moving into theory of mind. So you're looking at interpreting, is that dangerous or is that safe? Is that comfortable or is that uncomfortable? So you're basically, asking them to interpret the situation. What do you think they are doing? Maybe walking, maybe eating some food, maybe just climbing a tree, maybe taking a nap, maybe playing. Okay, an inference requires a lot more background information. So you have to bring a lot of knowledge in order to answer and interpret inferential information. So it could be background knowledge, it could be events that you think happened before or after. It's things not present in the picture at all, things that you have to bring knowledge to. So why do babies ride on their mother's backs? They're too small to walk fast or climb for protection, so that would be some background knowledge you have. Do other animals carry their babies on their backs? So you'd have to think about other things in your knowledge base. Monkeys, chimps, possums, gorillas, which animals carry their babies by the neck? And so you're doing comparisons with other animals. Where might you see a koala bear? In the zoo. Where do you think the koala bears will go once they're done, resting on that branch? And they would have to talk about what else a koala might do during the day. Evaluations. Evaluations go into making value judgments. Koala bears are cute, but should we try to touch or pet them? Why not? Because they're wild animals, they can hurt you. They can be very scared of humans. The mother might think you're trying to harm her baby. Wild animals are very different from pets. So should we keep animals in the zoo or leave them in the wild? Should we have animal sanctuaries in places where animals are endangered? So these evaluation kinds of questions. Analogies. How is the koala mother like your mother? She carried you as a baby. She protects and snuggles and feeds you. How are mothers and baby koalas different from human mothers? Different houses, look different, talk different. They're the koala bear. The koala mother was as nice as my mother. So you get these similes. Or you've got the koala bear looked beautiful. What's the word of an evaluation? All right, meta language. The first levels all established meaning. Meta language, you're going to ignore the meaning and now pay attention to form. Help the children read the sentence, I am a koala baby. So they have to learn the concept of wordness and what letters have to do with words. Give each child a chance to sequence the words to form a sentence. Help children identify the first letter and the corresponding sounds of words. Focus on articulation as needed. Find the verbs, find the nouns, find the pronouns. Any of those kinds of things that we do to talk about language as an entity on its own. Okay, so this continuum is characterized by a continuum of meaning from noticing down there with a reaction or an indication all the way up to meta-awareness. Each level requires words that refer to abstractions. Words are embedded in more complex syntax to express more complex relationships of meaning. So while you're looking at the semantics, other things are also happening. You need more abstract vocabulary. You need longer and more complex sentences in order to get those relationships of meaning down. The koala is hugging his mother because he may fall out of the tree. So that the description, he's hugging his mother, is a less complex sentence than something that's an interpretation, which needs the conjunction. He's hugging his mother because he could fall out of the tree. Each level is less obvious to the senses and more dependent on abstract thought and background knowledge. Each level requires more theory of mind, understanding other people's or animals' thoughts and motives. Each level requires greater reflection and judgment, and each level requires more imagining events before and after the pictured event. See the semantics panopto in order to learn more about the semantics. All right, and also these levels can be described descriptively at any age. So this is one of the books. We're using Fiji, the Fiji Flood from the same author. This one is Chapter 1, Shining Eyes. 10-year-old Sammy Westberg poked his older brother Bill on the arm. He whispered, when is the sunrise breakfast going to start? I'm starving, and my legs are falling off. His whisper shot through the nearly dark museum. The crowd of people around him frowned. Bill frowned at him too, so Sammy hit him, and he ran behind a stone post. Well, it seems relatively simple and straightforward at first, until you really look at the semantics of this language. Who do we meet in the opening scene? That's just a label, Sammy and Bill Westberg. How old are the boys? Tells you that Sammy is 10, and we assume that Bill is older, so that requires an inference. Where are they? They're in a dark museum. Attribute, how does Sammy feel? He's starving and his legs hurt. Interpretation, what do you think a sunrise breakfast might be? So it never tells you, that tells you they're at a sunrise breakfast, but it doesn't tell you what it is. So again, you start to have to interpret the language and make some decisions about what it's telling you. Inference. Why do you think the crowd is in the museum? It doesn't say, so you just have to encourage the kids to come up with ideas using their background knowledge. Why would people be in a museum? Why would they be there so early in the morning? Is this unusual? do they often have a sunrise and breakfast? And why would you have that sunrise breakfast? Must be something special going on. Evaluation. Name 3 ways that Sammy was misbehaving. He's complaining, he's hitting Bill, and he's running behind a post. So you have to have you have to look at that language um, and say, okay, these things are annoying to other people. He's misbehaving. Analogy. What does "my legs are falling off" mean? His whisper shot through the museum. His legs aren't literally falling off, so what does that expression mean? And obviously, a whisper is not really loud like a shot, so why did they say that his whisper shot through the museum? What does that tell you about what's happening in the museum? And then finally, meta-language. You can talk to the kids about figurative language. Uses words that give you an image of the meaning. So you're defining for the children figurative language. Those words are an exaggeration. Sammy's legs didn't fall off, but it's a good image of how much his legs hurt. Ask the students to, okay, so that's an example of teaching a concept like figurative language to the kids you're working with. Another element of meta-language, ask the students to spell whispered, which letter is silent. Spell museum and examine the vowels in that word. This is an example of providing pictures to the kids for these difficult concepts. So if you're reading a book that's going to have unusual concepts that they don't have the background knowledge for, then you have to help them provide the background knowledge. So you can draw things on a whiteboard, or I like to get a set of pictures ahead of time so that we can show the kids some of the things that they're trying to figure out from the words. Here's a metaphor. If you can lift my brother, you must be a forklift. So we've got the picture of the man actually lifting up Sammy, and then we've got the picture of the forklift. What does that mean? Well, if my brother Sammy is a pretty heavy little guy, if you can lift him up, then you must be strong like a forklift. Sheep on the New Zealand hillside are like ants at a picnic. And so when you've got food, the ants are going to come out and cover your picnic table if you leave it alone for a moment. And when you look at the picture of all of the sheep in New Zealand, they look like ants completely covering the hillside. So those are, just examples. They talk about the tattoos on the Maori men and the way that they stick out their tongue. They talk about things like stick and short clubs. So those are examples of what those look like in the Maori culture. A carved fish hook. So that's an example of a carved fish hook. A feathered cape. They talked about things like oil won't mix with water and it protects the wood. One of the houses was disassembled and covered with oil and buried beneath the ground, but it was by a river, so they had to protect it. So again, things that the kids aren't likely to know or understand, we picture those things. The Indian men had on animal masks, and you can see their eyes in the middle of the neck. Sammy was shocked that people had long necks like that, not realizing that most of it was the mask. Okay. Phonology. Long-term goal. Student will improve ability to use phonological and orthographic language to decode unknown words at a 3rd grade readability level. So, short term, given a 3rd grade narrative reading passage, the child will recognize the syllable patterns in single and polysyllabic words and use correct strategies to decode the words. So this means that they have to understand the meta-language of syllable patterns. If a vowel is between 2 consonants, the vowel is usually short. If there's 2 vowels together between 2 consonants, the vowel is usually long, or it's going to be a digraph. So those are double vowel patterns. You break the syllables, in a certain way. If there's 2 consonants together, you break the syllable between the consonants. If the syllable ends with a vowel, then the vowel is usually long in that syllable. Anyway, there's a million of these little rules that the kids have to be aware of in order to decode unfamiliar words. So how you achieve the goal of phonology. During reading of 2nd and 3rd grade reading passages, when the child does not recognize a word, the clinician will guide the child to decode the word by Step 1, writing the word on a whiteboard. Step 2, asking the child to find the vowels. by finding the vowels, because every syllable needs a vowel sound, you determine the number of syllables. Then you decode the first syllable using appropriate orthographic patterns. If, like I said, if the a single vowel is between two consonants, then it's going to be a short vowel, but under other circumstances, it's going to be a long vowel. Decode successive syllables using appropriate orthographic patterns, and then blend the syllables to decode the target word. And then finally, use phonic faces to visualize any or all of the steps as needed. This is just an example. Go back to the phonic faces in Pat 2 PowerPoint, where I showed you each one of these patterns. VC open syllable rule. When a vowel is followed by a consonant, the vowel is usually short. The little rule for that: when a baby starts to walk alone, the kid must grab the baby's hand. The babies are the short vowels, the kids are the consonants. So when a baby starts to walk alone, the kid must grab the baby's hand so the baby doesn't get hurt, but the baby gets to stay. So we see the syllable, we see the word apple, and basically there's two consonants together, so that would mean you would split that word into two syllables, and the first one shows a baby alone, but the kid grabs the hand, so the baby stays apple as opposed to apple. All right, here's egg. The baby gets to stay because the consonants grab her hand, his hand. It, the baby gets to stay because the consonant grabs her hand, it. Here's otter. Once again, we have the two syllables. In the first syllable, the baby stays because the T grabs his hand, ot. In the second one, ter, we have the R-colored vowel. All right. Examples of long and short-term goals. This one is discourse. Long-term goal: student will use narrative discourse structure to comprehend text at a third grade readability level. So far we've worked a lot on sentence and word levels, but discourse level is just as important and just as detrimental to comprehension and reading fluency. So our short-term goal is going to be: given a story episode that is comprised of a complete story structure at a third grade level, student will recount the events using a storyboard: character, time, setting, initiating event, problem, plan, attempt, outcome, and evaluation with 90% accuracy. Our pretest recalling with prompts was only 40%. Independent recall was only 25%. Note that retelling is also one of the primary measures of comprehension, so many tests ask the child to retell what they just read as a measure of comprehension, and we're hoping to increase that by post-test. Any story is going to be made up of dozens of episodes. So intervention: how will you achieve the goal for narrative discourse? During reading of a second to third grade reading passages, the child will be asked to summarize the episode just read. Usually a few paragraphs or pages is an episode using a storyboard. Okay, so let's explain what happened in this part of the story. Use the board to explain the important events. Guide, prompt, model, or use other strategies to prompt a complete retelling. So this is an example of mapping something out that as you are reading it using a storyboard. We've got our storyboard on the left: time, character, place, initiating event, problem, plan, attempt, outcome, and evaluation. So the first couple of pages, you started out late at night. Charlie and Joe was the place. They were on a computer, so probably at home. The initiating event: they needed to help their mom. The problem was they're trying to get into a bank file, needed a code. Plan was to steal the purse of a bank executive to get their code number. And then that episode was interrupted by the next episode, which again was just a couple of pages in the same chapter. Late at night, Frank and Ellen, were on a computer at Ellen's house. And the initiating event: they were trying to enter a chat room. And problem: they kept getting a computer error. And their plan: try to find out what this strange code means. And so their attempt will trace the origin and wait for the next logon. So they're going to, set up a trap for somebody. Another couple of pages in the same chapter. The next day, Frank and Ellen, and where? At school. And what was the initiating event? They're trying to make sense of the strange code. Problem was they still can't figure it out. So their plan, they looked at a math book and they found a random numbers table. And their outcome then was that the numbers fit this strange pattern, and they were successful. Later on, late that night, Frank and Ellen were on the same computer at Ellen's home. They log into the origin site. The problem is they have to wait for the other user, and then finally in their plan, after 3 hours, others started to log in, and the log takes them to the bank files. And then the outcome, something is very wrong. Okay, so basically, you just keep helping the kids profile the information according to story grammar that they're reading in these little episodes. The episodes aren't marked in any obvious way like chapters are. Episodes, you just have to figure out from knowing story grammar when an episode ends, identify the problem, identify their plan to solve the problem, identify what happens in their attempt to implement that plan. You just have to learn this kind of strategy. Kids who are poor readers read every single sentence as if they're all equally important, or as if they all just give you, a bunch of factual information, and they don't read it according to discourse structures. Here's another example of using storyboards to help them profile things. Lily the lion was taken away from her home in Africa in a cage. So that's the time, the character, and the place. The beginning action, she was sold to a circus and had to do tricks every day. Problem, then she and the tigers had to stay in small cages for the rest of the time. The plan, somebody had a plan to give Lily back her life in Africa. One day Lily was put in a big box. The plan was put on an airplane. Attempt, after a long trip, the box was carried for a long time. Lily was scared, but when they opened the box, Lily was back in Africa. She could go anywhere she wanted. So that was the evaluation. So organizing information, we often use these for writing without the text in there, but we help the kids, tell a little story about the pictures, and then they write the story that they see in each part of the plan. Okay, another area, pragmatics. Long-term goal. Student will interpret the intentions of goals of characters in a story, including interpreting dialogue appropriately. Short-term goal. Given a third grade reading passage, student will read dialogue with appropriate intonation to differentiate speaker, interlocutor, and narrator, and answer questions about the character's motives and feelings with 90% accuracy. Okay. This requires theory of mind and higher level semantics. All right, so intervention. During a reading of second to third grade reading passages, when dialogue is not read with correct intonation, speech bubbles will be used. So if they don't know how the punctuation of dialogue works, then you have to teach it. So we always draw speech bubbles. We show how you can erase the speech bubble. I'll do this on a whiteboard. I can just capture a little corner of the speech bubble by using the quotation marks. Then I can, capture the end of the quotation with closed quotation marks. The comma basically goes usually before the quotation mark, and it marks that you're changing the role from the person who's speaking the quotation into the narrator's role. And then the entire sentence, including the person speaking and the narrator, get placed in a single sentence with a period at the end. All right, this is still, a lot for kids, so very often we act it out. And we do role playing. So you be Frog and you be Toad and you be the narrator. So we basically have the kids, actually role play by reading parts of the text, and the narrator is just as much of an actor as the other kids. So in our little story below here, in quotations, the frog says, "She will never kiss me." And then the narrator said the frog sadly. The narrator reads the next line too that does not have quotes around it. Just then the princess looked at him. And then we have dialogue, so the princess has quotations around hers. You are my prince. And then the narrator chimes in again saying, said the princess and kissed him. The narrator has to become just as much a part of the dialogue and have a role. Otherwise, the kids don't understand who's speaking and who's just telling you about it. The thing about the narrator is that's not part of oral language. She will never kiss me, said the frog. Well, I don't sit here as a speaker going, she will never kiss me, said Jan Norris, looking sad. Those things you get from the expression of my face, where I'm standing, who I'm talking to, those are all things in a visual conversation or a face-to-face conversation. Those are things that you get from the visual context. So basically, when you don't have that kind of visual context, then you have to have a narrator role who's telling you who said what and what they looked like and where they were standing and if they stomped out of the room or if they ran over and hugged somebody else. The narrator has to provide all of that information, and kids have to learn how to handle dialogue. Here's another pragmatic goal. Student will actively participate in a group discussion. So the short-term goal, given a group exploration of a third grade reading passage, student will take turns, provide the appropriate amount of information during a turn, and maintain the topic with 90% accuracy. So you want them to be able to communicate effectively and appropriately within a group. So this is an example. During second to third grade reading passage, a response board will be used to prompt correct and appropriate answers, the go circle, and to cue inappropriate or off-topic kinds of things, stop circle, and I could say with 90% accuracy. Okay, so this is just a visual I use with kids. So when we're talking about something that's happening in the book, the go circle is the answer right here. What did Goldilocks eat? And it tells you right in the text that Goldilocks ate some porridge. So you can guide the kids to find that information. Or if you do have to read between the lines, and so if this is more interpretive. How did Papa Bear feel? It said Goldilocks is sleeping in Papa Bear's bed. There she is, growled Papa Bear. So it doesn't actually say that he was angry, but you have to read between the lines and do some theory of mind thought that if he's yelling, there she is, that he's not saying it because he's happy and excited. So those would be appropriate answers. What is porridge? Now you're asking for an inference coming from your general knowledge or your background knowledge, or will she eat all of the porridge kind of thing. So those are kinds of questions that are maybe appropriate to the discussion. But then you've got the kids that go on and on and on. Well, I know what porridge is because I saw this movie and they had porridge and they were in England and blah, 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 blah. Or they keep talking out of turn when it's not their turn, or they keep adding irrelevant information. So oh, porridge is it's like a cereal or something. Well, I like cereal, and I also like donuts, and we go to the store and we get donuts, but there's only one kind I like, and so it's off-task, irrelevant information. So we use that stop sign to say, wait, this is not appropriate to our interaction. You have to give the right amount of information. You have to give relevant information. You have to take turns to give your information. And so that visual helps them. All right, so we've gone through a whole range of language literacy goals that if we want to see improvements in reading, those are the kinds of things that you need to work on. Your writing goals are going to be very parallel. Reading is like listening. The author of the book creates the syntax, picks the vocabulary, uses the cohesive ties, asks the inferential, or writes out the inferential kinds of paragraphs, puts in the similes in the figurative language, organizes the discourse structure along narrative structure or expository structure, sort of paradigms, does the spelling for you. Reading is basically like listening. The author is the speaker and you are the listener, and you have to learn how to interpret. So that's receptive language. Writing, on the other hand, is more expressive language. You are the person that has to pick the topic, put it in discourse structure, choose the sentence, the syntax that you're going to use to express your ideas, put in the right vocabulary and the right semantic ideas, choose the spelling, figure out the spelling, um, you know, use discourse, quotation marks and different kinds of punctuation in order to mark what you want the listener to interpret, etc., etc. So it's the expression. So it's the sister or the other side of the coin to reading. Here's a SMART goal for writing. Pretest data. Use pretest data to establish realistic goals. Data shows fourth grade child wrote a story on the tool with run-on sentences, grammatical and morphological errors, more than 5 errors in punctuation, no character development, incomplete plot, and poor spelling, attaining a grade equivalency of 2.2. Time, 1 semester. 1 session weekly. Realistic improvement, estimated improvement will be a 3.0 grade equivalency. Achievable, you'll have 45 minutes each week to work toward the goal. Measure, you will measure MLU, syntactic accuracy, story grammar, spelling. Specific, write with 90% conventional spelling, increase MLU to 6.6, and use all 6 elements of story grammar. So those are an example. Okay. By the end of the year, a child will write a grade-appropriate narrative with average MLU, complete narrative structure, and conventional spelling. So it's another long-term goal. To accomplish this, the child will need to improve his or her ability to produce syntax, cohesion, vocabulary, higher-level semantics, phonology, orthography, narrative or expository text structure, morphology, and pragmatics. So once again, these become your measurable goals. Here's just an example for writing of a phonology goal. The long-term goal, student will improve ability to use phonological and orthographic language to spell words at the transitional and conventional level. Short-term goal, when asked to write a story in response to an action picture, so those are the conditions. The student will correct spelling errors when cued, to include the correct number of syllables, all sounds in the correct sequence and word position for both syllables and words, and correct vowel sound, phonological awareness, represented with a plausible orthographic representation. So you're not asking for perfect spelling, but somewhere in the transitional to conventional spelling with 90% accuracy. At the beginning, the child only had 25% conventional spelling and 25% transitional spelling meaning that they're maybe using a silent E instead of a double vowel for a long vowel, but they're using something realistic. And 50% was at the more immature semiphonetic or phonetic spelling stage. So you're hoping that they'll move that percentage up to 90% transitional and conventional. So this is just a phonology goal, and you would have goals for, syntax and morphology, etc. Now, I've given you a very expansive range of goals. Of course, you won't have that many on your IEP. You're going to look for the things that are that are very indicative of the problems for your child, and you're going to pick out 2 or 3 reading goals and 2 or 3 written language goals, writing goals. So basically, if the measures of those things change, you can see how interrelated all of these are. If the things change on 2 or 3 of your goals, then you can assume that other things will also change. So if syntax and discourse improve, cohesion probably improves and semantics probably improves. So you're going to choose 2 or 3 rather than the 7 or 8 that I've given you. And then your overall goal is, if all of those things start to change, then your overall goal of reading at a higher readability level with fluency, good intonation, rate, and comprehension should be met if you give another reading test. All right, so how are you going to achieve the goal of phonology? Provide the child a picture or picture sequence used to support the child's attempt to write a story. If the child produces spelling error, immediately provide feedback. So this is what I want you to do, and go back and look at the writing, PowerPoint and the alphabet writing. Tell the child what his or her spelling tells your mouth to say. Your spelling tells my mouth to say prud, but it should say proud. Ask the child to focus on the part of the word in air. So let's look at the vowels. That's something about that vowel is not telling my mouth to say proud. You used a shorter baby U vowel. Watch the sound my mouth makes when I say proud. What two letters are used to spell that sound? Use the phonic faces to help the child identify the target vowel or spelling. You can use the chart. That chart is vowels on one side and consonants on the other side. So you can help the child, look at the bottom row, which has all of the digraphs and the diphthong vowels. And you can say, look at the bottom row and figure out which one is making my mouth say proud. Do not provide the spelling, so do not just give children the correct spelling. They've learned nothing. Rather have the child use phonemic awareness to think about each sound and provide immediate feedback on what it tells your mouth to say. So if they choose OI, then say, that told my mouth to say proid, so that's not right. Proud, proud. Look at my lips. They're kind of rounding. And so look at the choices of the letters. If they look at AU, that would say, oh, now you told my mouth to say prod, prod. And you need proud, proud. So you keep giving them feedback so that they can see the consequences of different spelling attempts. And then point out similarities to other words fitting that same pattern. So we've got proud and loud, crowd. You can show them how sometimes it's OW and sometimes it's OU, but it's the same pattern. Okay, so I want you to use the models that I've given you, the reading, long and short-term goals, to create parallel goals in syntax, semantics, cohesion, discourse, morphology, etc. in writing. Apply these models to write goals for your client and use the long and short-term goals to guide your intervention. So basically back to the beginning of this PowerPoint, the point of goals was to tell you where you're going. It gives you a map of what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to get there. What are the steps you're going to take to get there? So when you looked at this PowerPoint, it very specifically lays out the pattern of what you need to do in intervention in order to achieve that goal of getting your child to read at a higher grade level with fluency and accuracy. It breaks it down into what are the things that the child needs to be able to do that the child can't do right now in order to improve their level. Okay, so thank you very much.